Greetings, I'm Michael Quinn Patton. Eleanor Chelimsky was a colleague and friend, and this video is a tribute to her legacy, to her life, and to her evaluation contributions. She died on March 6, 2022 at the age of 95. And I've spent the last few days going through her writings, our email exchanges, and thinking about what Eleanor contributed to our field, to our profession, and to me personally. And I want to share some of that. Before doing so, I want to say a few words about how I suggest you approach this video and what I hope it accomplishes. Just 4 things that this video will hopefully do. First is to deepen your knowledge about evaluation theory and practice through sharing the wisdom, thoughts, reflections, samples of the writings of Eleanor Chelimsky. They are extraordinary. They are gems. They are worth savoring. Second, as you experience her knowledge and wisdom, I hope that gives you a sense of how you, if you are a new evaluator, a veteran evaluator, considering evaluation, partly engaged in evaluation, it will stimulate you to think about your place in the river of evaluation by knowing more about its origins. For Eleanor Chelimsky was a part of creating this profession, and we are all following her flow. She was not great in stature, but huge in intellect. One of the giants on whose shoulders we all stand. And so in learning more about her and taking the time to reflect on her contributions and writings, I also hope it will give you a great sense of pride to be a part of this profession. This profession has attracted some incredible people. And that community of scholars, researchers, evaluators, change makers, people who care about the world, about the less fortunate, about sustainability, about making systems work on behalf of those less advantaged, people who've dedicated themselves to do those things through evaluation have created a profession of which we can be proud, and be proud to point to those intellectual and practice giants who are our forebears. Eleanor Chelimsky is amongst the most important of that group. And finally, I promise you that if you take the time to stay with this, you will be inspired by our field, by her hope, by her vision for what evaluation is and what it still has to accomplish, what it can be. So in saying that, I want to suggest that you not rush through this. I would hope that you would come to this at a time when you can spend some time with it. Not fast forward, not take little pieces. Get a cup of tea or coffee, glass of wine, glass of beer, cold glass of water, whatever would put you into a place of reflection, of openness, of meditation, of reverence, to consider the life and contributions, insights and knowledge of Eleanor Chelimsky. I'm going to begin with a brief video clip from an interview that George Grobe did with Eleanor at the launching of the Eleanor Chelimsky Theory and Practice Forum of the Eastern Evaluation Research Society in 2013. This video will include a couple of brief excerpts, clips from videos of Eleanor, and a good place to begin to experience Eleanor herself. In this clip, she's talking about her forming a symposium to consider the issue of evaluation use in 1976.
Began stuff used, had a symposium. This was an important thing for me. It was a learning experience.
Do you remember the date?
Yes, it was in 76.
Okay.
And it was on the use of evaluation. And what I did was I brought together sponsors from agencies and researchers. And they talked about, what was wrong with evaluations that were specifically mentioned that had not been used, that had been left on the shelf.
Okay.
I got them, to focus on particular evaluations, and also on one that was magnificently used. Why was that? And so we found almost immediately that everybody had very different conceptions of evaluation.
Right.
The users wanted something that answered their questions.
Right.
And the evaluators had their own interests in many cases. They were much more interested in whether the theory behind the program worked or not.
Right.
And the sponsors couldn't care less.
Right, okay.
They wanted to know how to fix the program so that people were happy and that the Congress would get off their back.
Okay.
So it was a very interesting thing. That's where I came up with that idea of the accountability evaluations.
Right, okay.
That was the need to stratify them, because with accountability evaluations, you're not looking for use at all.
Okay.
You shouldn't expect it.
Right.
And for knowledge, you may or may not, but for management, you absolutely need it. And for development, developing capacity within agencies, that's when I learned about the need to do that, because I could see some of the agencies I had invited were talking about evaluation and they didn't understand it.
Yeah.
So that clip gives you a sense of the vivacious energy and commitment that Eleanor brings to evaluation, her keen intellect, and the importance of the distinctions that she brought to the field that we now take for granted between accountability, evaluation for management, evaluation for learning and knowledge development, that these have become mainstays of our field, but those distinctions originated with Eleanor Chelimsky. So with that as context, let me get into the work that she did at GAO that was so groundbreaking and remains among, if not the most important and influential evaluation unit in the history of the field. GAO's Program Evaluation and Methodology Division was created by Eleanor in 1980. GAO was an organization of auditors. Evaluation was new to GAO and became increasingly important in changing what GAO has done and will do. Between 1980 and 1994, the unit was charged with doing evaluations for Congress and improving GAO's methodological capabilities. With 80 to 100 people, her unit had between 45 to 50 evaluations underway at any given time and produced 30 major reports annually. The unit did hugely influential evaluations on programs and policies as diverse as chemical weapons, drinking age laws, Medicare, medical devices, AIDS education, highway safety, cancer research, taxation, welfare, immigration, and indeed the full range of federal initiatives of all kinds. PEMD used established methods rigorously, creatively employed old methods in new ways, and developed and demonstrated groundbreaking approaches in synthesis methods, prospective evaluation, mixed methods, and how to generate rigorous and credible evaluation findings on hugely controversial, contested, and politicized issues. And former staff of Eleanor's went on to work in many other agencies, establish independent consulting practices, help create the International Program for Development Evaluation Training, helped found the International Development Evaluation Association, and many other contributions to our field. Under her leadership, the unit conducted over 300 evaluations of government policies and programs for Congress, including this thing called prospective evaluation. Eleanor told me about the first time that she was invited to testify before Congress about a policy under consideration, not one that was already being implemented, but to evaluate the proposal for a policy, to bring evaluative knowledge, synthesize prior evaluation studies and research, bring all that to bear prospectively on creating a new policy. Breakthrough role for evaluation, and Eleanor Chelimsky pioneered it. She wrote extensively about credibility and how use depends on credibility. I want to quote her on these insights because they remain important. She said the need to be methodologically credible is part and parcel of the evaluator's armamentarium. What a great word. Evaluator's armamentarium. So much better than our toolbox. Our armamentarium. It is ingrained, a product of our training and our awareness that the ultimate audience for our work will be other evaluators. That's an unusual way to think about it. To think about not just the utility and credibility to intended users, but to think about doing the work that's credible to your peers, that will be respected and credible to peers. That's part of how Eleanor thought about her work. At GAO, the evaluation staff had so many experiences in which our need for credibility succeeded in countering the various pressures brought by congressional or agency stakeholders that after a while we developed all our evaluation designs with an eye toward defending them, thinking at the design stage about how you would defend the design decisions, including methods and analysis choices. Also, because all our work often depended on its methodological quality, there was a utilization-focused component, along with self-defense and survivability inherent in our efforts. She wrote, quote, "The foundation of evaluation use is credibility, not just information, but credible information. Quote, whether the issue is fairness, balance, methodological quality, or accuracy, no effort to establish credibility is ever wasted. The memory of poor quality lingers long." The memory of poor quality lingers long. Credibility and therefore utility are affected by the steps we take to make our evaluative decisions, also intellectually, in the effort we put forth to look at all sides and all stakeholders of an evaluation. Quote, the perception of impartiality. The perception of impartiality is at least as important as methodological rigor in highly political environments. And she worked in the highest political environment. Contested, polarized, not as bad as it is today, but highly political. She wrote, although all of us realize that we can never be entirely objective, that is hardly an excuse for bad work, skewed samples, grandiloquent conclusions, or generalizations that go beyond the evaluator's data, or for any of 101 indications to a careful reader that a particular result is more desired than documented. In her 2006 keynote to the American Evaluation Association, she regaled us with stories of dealing with the political machinations of Congress, and she titled her presentation, quote, "A Clash of Cultures, Improving the Fit Between Evaluative Independence and the Political Requirements of a Democratic Society," of which she was deeply savvy and influential. And that tension nicely captures the challenge. Extensively, insightfully, and experientially about the politics of evaluation, about attempts by those in power to hide data from evaluators or suppress evaluation findings, including by classifying reports as top secret. So she wrote, quote, "Evaluators will have to learn to deal with secrecy even as it expands to grotesque levels, and even as happened to us." And I've always loved this story she told, where they faced the bizarre situation in which their report was classified so high that they, the evaluators who wrote it, were no longer allowed to read it. Logical Lee Seacrest, a former American Evaluation Association evaluation president and one of our methodological pioneers, knew her unit well and said of it, quote, "It is the jewel in the crown of program evaluation at the federal level for a good many years," close quote. The jewel in the crown, both that unit that Eleanor created and that phrase is appropriate to describe Eleanor herself, the jewel in the program evaluation crown. In 1976, she helped found the Evaluation Research Society, and after ERS and Evaluation Network merged in 1984, she subsequently in 1995 became the president of AEA. The theme that she chose, which is what each president does, choose the annual conference theme, the theme she chose was Evaluation for a New Century, a Global Perspective. And in doing so, she created our first international evaluation conference, a joint effort between the American Evaluation Association and the Canadian Evaluation Society in Vancouver that was a real breakthrough in the international community of evaluation. That conference was subsequently put together in a book called Evaluation for the 21st Century that she edited with Will Shadish. I've just reviewed it again, and the chapters and presentations remain enormously relevant for our current time and looking forward. Evaluation for the 21st Century. The Eastern Evaluation Research Society established the Eleanor Chelimsky Forum on Theory and Practice. This forum stemmed from a presentation that she made at the Eastern Evaluation Research Society in 2012, a paper entitled Balancing Theory and Practice in the Real World. And in that paper, she recommended that a forum be established to mediate between the divide between principle and context, between theory and practice. And so her vision was that theory and practice would inform each other, and, quote, in that learning process, both would be inspired to stretch, to bend a little, to grow, therefore adding breadth, depth, and realism to our work. She wrote, quote, if we are successful balancing the two, both theory and practice will be changed. So let me show you another short video clip from Eleanor inaugurating that conference in 2013.
You're right. I'm just so glad to be here for 1,000 reasons, but especially because I think what we're going to do today is very useful. You know, I see evaluation as maybe the best hope we have for keeping governments honest and for, you know, speaking up where things are not going the way they should, for intelligent innovation, for delivering decent services to people, and above all, for putting the public interest at the top of the agenda, where it isn't always these days. So my sense, and I'm not speaking for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation either, but my sense is that, you know, it's a great tool. It's indirect, it's modest, it's simple, you know, a little data here, a few documents there, and suddenly we contribute to the public debate in a serious way. So it's a great tool, but as far as we've gone, nationally and internationally, it seems to me that we haven't confronted some of our internal processes the way we should, and we haven't, you know, put theory in front of practice and practice in front of theory. And until we do that, it seems to me we've got a way to go. So I think we're doing something important today by doing that. And it seems to me that it's that blurred area between what you could call quantified reality and the reality of the real world that we've got to look at carefully. And
so now that you have a sense of some of Eleanor Chelimsky's important contributions to evaluation, let me conclude with some of her own reflections about what influenced her, an opportunity to think for each of us, for each of you, about what you bring to your evaluation work or whatever work you do. There was a special issue of New Directions for Evaluation, created and edited by David Williams, about how some of us were influenced by our early childhood, our families, our schooling, our relationships. And Eleanor Chelimsky was one of the pioneers featured in that volume. She entitled her chapter, Probing the Past to Understand the Present, and asked, can we relate early training and life experience to our evaluative orientations, which she did brilliantly. So I want to share a bit from that and from her oral biography in the American Journal of Evaluation to conclude this commemoration. She wrote, there's so many of these connections, early influences. My parents, for example, were big on rational decision making, and I was taught early on to try to envision all potential costs and benefits when making choices. So for all of us who are parents, this gives us pause to think about how our parenting affects our children and how we've been affected by how our parents raised us. She wrote, and although my parents were good about letting me make at least some decisions for myself, I always had to explain exactly how I came to make them. What were the pros and cons, especially the intangible ones, and what were the long-term results? I was expecting not just the likely ones, but the unlikely ones as well. What were the long-term results I was expecting? Not just the likely ones, but the unlikely ones as well. So as I look at it from a connections point of view, my parents gave me a two-edged gift there. Not only the habit of thinking about potential losses and longer-term gains, but also the confidence necessary to make decisions, which has certainly been useful to me in music as well as in evaluation. However, among the diversity of influences I've assimilated, two aspects of my early experience are the most closely connected to the way I've conceived and practiced evaluation. These are musical training and performance, and lessons learned as a consequence of living in Paris. In the oral history of evaluation, she writes about that early musical training. Music has remained a big part of my life, she wrote, and it certainly conditions the way I think. When you play a Bach fugue, for example, your mind needs to work horizontally and vertically, while also keeping the larger musical structure front and center. This is not so different from what we do in evaluation, although of course we talk about joining analytic and synthetic thought processes rather than vocal line harmony and musical form. Also, the need for a performer to carefully consider his or her functional relationship with an audience is pretty good training for thinking about use and users in evaluation. In both cases, we must satisfy our users, but too much effort to please is the death of the enterprise. Too much effort to please is the death of the enterprise. She wrote about the audience as an integral component of music and evaluation. My thinking about evaluation users was influenced by the process I had gone through as a pianist, trying to work out what made a musical performance credible to the different kinds of people in a concert audience, and how, or whether, I should change an interpretation in consequence. At the Government Accountability Office, we had many dissimilar users, including the relevant actors in the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government, along with GAO's own auditors. But these users were no more dissimilar than the concert audiences I knew, made up of persons from different backgrounds, different levels of musical knowledge, different national musical cultures. So Eleanor Chelimsky was a professional concert pianist, and she played in Carnegie Hall, she played in Europe as an accomplished professional pianist. I had seen that a certain kind of traditional Beethoven playing, for example, could be well respected in Stuttgart, but criticized as dry or formal in Paris or Milan. Within a single concert audience, some listeners appreciated sophisticated nuances, while others were oblivious. Some loved innovative interpretations, but some were impatient with the slightest deviation from the accepted standard. I realized that in evaluation, as in music, I needed to move away from the perspective of the evaluation producer and consider much more carefully the perspective of the evaluation user, and B, there could be some danger in doing that. Just as too much emphasis given to audience reactions at a concert can lessen the pianist's reverence for the composer's intentions and transform a valid interpretation into an effort at crowd pleasing, too much emphasis on user credibility can cause evaluators to soften or lose entirely some important lessons from their work. Boy, there's a lot of wisdom there, a lot to reflect on, important, real lived experience from Eleanor's music and evaluation experience. She wrote 3 things done at GAO influenced by musical training and performing. First, I developed a checklist of my own for my own use in assessing the credibility of our reports from a reader's viewpoint. Among other things, I included T.S. Eliot's 6 criteria for quality in poetry, which acknowledge both the need for integrity in the work and the need for persuasiveness directed at the readers. Heavy-duty stuff here. Murder boards. Second, before every congressional testimony, I held what we called, quote, murder boards, close quote. All the staff who'd worked on an evaluation would get together, think about what could be most controversial among the findings, and imagine what arguments might be raised against them, in what context, and by whom. We would look up the professional background of everyone sitting on the relevant congressional committee to see how they might react. Most members of Congress were lawyers, but many came from backgrounds that were very different. Their political affiliations were different. Their views of the public interest, especially with regard to scope of government versus equality of opportunity, were different. And some had much more of a state-local orientation than a federal or national one. These murder boards could reach extremities because we were preparing to defend our work against anything that might conceivably be asked, and staff would sometimes think up what appeared to be quite preposterous questions. No effort was ever wasted. Some of these questions, some of these supposedly preposterous questions, actually did end up being posed at congressional hearings, and the exercise forced us to look at our reports from a user's point of view. Think about doing a murderer's review for your evaluation. And then integrating audiences. The third thing I did at GAO that involved integrating audiences into our evaluation concept was trying to produce evaluation reports that, although they couldn't be beautiful, glorious, or sublime, like music, were at least focused on the question, written with clarity, well organized in form, interesting in content, and pleasurable to read. Clarity, well organized, interesting in content, and pleasurable to read. She writes, I was, of course, absurdly trying to imbue evaluation with some of the musical splendors lost in my past, and naturally that effort didn't often succeed. But when it did, we always recognized that success because we found evidence from the questions we received that the reports had for once been carefully read and understood by our audiences. I don't know about you, but I find these reflections from Eleanor inspiring. She also wrote about differences between music and evaluation. A big difference between music and evaluation is that when you play a concert, the music you make may not be appreciated by everyone in the audience, but at least it's always heard. Evaluation reports, on the other hand, can be so repetitious, obscure, awkwardly phrased, and competently opposed by their political enemies that they are never read at all. Eleanor describes having what she called, quote, bias toward innovation, close quote. And this is such an important insight now for the work Evaluation is currently engaged in and looking forward, that I want to dwell on this and her insights and quote it at length. She says, quote, despite a few conservative artists here and there, along with a great many ultra-conservative patrons and audiences, innovation has always been one of the ways we've judged the quality of a work of art. Indeed, classical musicians are carefully trained to recognize the specific types of innovation that have characterized each composer, and few criticisms are more devastating to a musician than the adjective derivative. Wagner with his chromatic harmonies, Debussy with his transformative ninths, and Schoenberg with his 12-tone system are all exemplars of this musical attachment to innovation that marked my early training and that I brought with me to evaluation. One particular aspect of evaluation that forces innovation is that practicing evaluators often find themselves in situations that have not been studied by theorists, so the very circumstances of our work oblige them to innovate. But this is different from music, where innovation is not just an order of business, but rather the hallmark of the composer or performing artist. So I see now that my training probably made innovation an article of faith for me and pushed me to take risks in evaluation that were not necessarily appreciated at GAO, where the traditionalism of the auditor could make change difficult. But like music, evaluation is an ongoing enterprise in which learning builds on learning. Evaluation is an ongoing enterprise in which learning builds on learning. New kinds of evaluation questions, new appreciations of context relevance, new understandings of the past, all lead to new methods, mixed methods, greater inclusiveness, different areas of emphasis. Again, worth pausing and taking in the depth of those insights. Eleanor also describes having been influenced by painting, her husband, Oskar Chelimsky, being an accomplished painter. She wrote, in a larger sense, I've been influenced by the complicated attitudes that painters have toward liberty. That is, conciliating freedom of expression with the demands of form. To some degree, we face that same problem in evaluation, trying to conciliate knowledge with usefulness. And of course, we end up tinkering a lot. For me, one way of dealing with that has been to specify evaluation questions very tightly. You may lose some knowledge perhaps, and certainly some freedom, but you also increase the likelihood of usefulness. During her time working for NATO, before she went to GAO, she described what she learned there. I learned a lot at NATO, not just the need for standardized measures and data. Indeed, by the time I left there in 1970, the data situation had considerably improved, and I had worked hard to get that to happen. Mostly I got embroiled in an intense process of networking with NATO's wonderful international staff, which taught me the importance of bargaining, quid pro quos, persuasiveness, and just plain pleading. But I also had a baptism of fire with respect to politics. No work I did after NATO could ever seem as complex, as Byzantine, as intractable as trying to do meaningful evaluative work and get it used by 15 user nations with differing individual agendas. I'm not talking here about users that merely refuse to listen to what you found, but users with warring interests. Even within the U.S. delegation, which was a joint defense state mission, people had profoundly diverging interests. And this was complicated even more by our own users, people in the Defense and State Departments back in Washington, whose agenda were often, once again, different from those of people in the field. I wanted to include this because NATO is very much in the forefront of the news today with the Russian war in Ukraine, and many more nations in NATO, but recognizing that Eleanor Chelimsky had an important time working in NATO and learning about the politics of multiple, divergent, polarized intended users. She described fighting for evaluation and evaluator independence. She said in the interview, "Yes, and of course, as in all political universes, I had my first experiences with censorship and secrecy. That is, people fooling around with my conclusions, trying to make them say what they weren't intended to say, removing important footnotes that were politically inconvenient. That was another critical piece of apprenticeship, learning that you could be as independent as all get out and produce work that was as close to objective as you could manage, but that other people could then revise your work without so much as a by your leave or any opportunity for you to affect the revisions. I think this experience really changed my focus from a fairly intransigent pursuit of knowledge to the recognition that just making a difference, improving the status quo, wasn't so bad. Still, evaluative independence became a big issue for me, and I've fought ever since for the right of evaluators to report what they found without political interference." She also did a stint at the MITRE Corporation. "Another thing I grasped at MITRE," she reported, "was the need to understand and deal with organizational politics. We were a small evaluation unit, about 25 social scientists embedded in a much larger world of 2,000 engineers, many of them computer types. A few initial bureaucratic defeats taught me that I had a lot to learn about engineers. For one thing, they're not interested in theory. Of course, they'll use theory if they can, if it happens to fit, but they see themselves as hands-on people, and when they begin to work on a problem, they have a mental picture of some object, say a bridge, that they're going to construct, and they depend almost entirely on experience, not theory, in their planning and in deciding whether something can be done. Naturally, if there happens to be some theory attached, that's just fine, but they're going to build the bridge anyway. Social scientists don't think like that. So I had big translations to make all the time of why we were doing this and not that with respect to crime problems or technological innovation or the utilization of research. I wished later that I had paid more attention to this issue. I should have made more notes about the difficulties for an evaluation unit of working within a larger, dominant, quite different culture. I didn't realize how common a problem this was for evaluators in government, always working in a relatively small office surrounded by lawyers or engineers or economists or scientists or auditors or whatever the dominant culture of an agency happened to be. Many of you listening to this are internal evaluators, are evaluators who are located in large national organizations, nonprofit organizations, philanthropic organizations, government organizations. And I hope you can take some comfort from the experience and knowledge of Eleanor Chelimsky, recognizing how challenging that is and also how important it is, and that she learned a great deal from it and continued out of that experience to fight for evaluation integrity and independence. She talks about congressional evaluation use. In the interview in AJE, Valerie Caroscelli asked, "You've influenced so many people in so many ways as a leader in our field, as a speaker of truth to power, as a mentor, as a change agent in one of the oldest federal agencies, and through the impact of evaluations you and your staff completed. What evaluation or evaluations among those of Eleanor Chelimsky do you think were most influential?" A chance for Eleanor to reflect upon what evaluation she was most proud of. And she responded, "Our reports on chemical warfare published in 1983. Most importantly, it was the opening paper among 11 chemical warfare studies that we did for the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. I still treasure the letter I received from Dante Fascell, chairman of the committee, who wrote me out of the blue on June 14, 1990, that our work, quote, made an important contribution to the bilateral chemical weapons agreement between the U.S. and the USSR, and, quote, proved to be a crucial factor in the formulation of U.S. policy, close quote. he was writing to thank us. That first report was deceptively simple, just bringing together what was known in the areas of congressional interest. But it was a strong and influential paper because it showed the extraordinary dependence on opinion and the utter lack of data-based evidence supporting the Department of Defense's push toward an increased chemical warfare capability. The end of the odyssey came on July 13, 1990, when Defense Secretary Dick Cheney finally ordered the military to shut down U.S. chemical arms production facilities as a result of the U.S.-Soviet agreement. And the report that Eleanor's unit produced contributed to that monumental decision. She talks about the tension between use and taking on critical high-stakes issues. The fact is that a very large part of our work at the PEMD was well used by Congress. Our reports on Medicare, medical devices, AIDS education, highway safety, cancer research, and many others. But it's not the use of our work alone that seems most important to me. Rather, it was the willingness of the evaluators in the unit to take on difficult public policy issues that were critical in and of themselves, regardless of whether their findings would be used. The problem is that there's a tension between getting your work used and taking on critical evaluative issues, because doing the latter can sometimes preclude use when findings challenge the conventional wisdom and the powerful interests are at stake. What I'm saying, she said, is that if we use too much, we may lose sight of our duty to take on evaluations that query the basis for beliefs about programs or policies, out of fear that such work will be ignored or involve us in controversy. Of course, the chemical warfare work embodied both those ideas, and we weren't really expecting any success at all. We were simply questioning the basis for a belief in chemical warfare deterrent. Nobody wanted us to do that, either at GAO or the Department of Defense, and yet the work was, in the end, fantastically well used. Here, Eleanor is prescient about a major issue of our time for evaluation, about not just looking at whether programs are doing things right, but are they doing the right things? Not just effectiveness, but bringing a value perspective in. And she, in this work, talks about having to do both of those things. Are things being done well, but are they the right things to do? And that we have an obligation to engage in both of those questions. The prospective evaluation synthesis that I referred to earlier was also an important breakthrough. She writes that in working for Congress, I realized that although evaluators tend to think retrospectively, our legislative users were, like all politicians, fixated on the future. Well, what do all these conclusions from past studies and past experience tell us about how to shape programs and policies for the coming years? We would be asked regularly. Thinking about it, I came little by little to understand that prospective studies were not really that foreign to us. For example, we are always trying to estimate what would have happened in the absence of a program. It's an intrinsic part of time series analyses, of simulations, and so on. However, uncomfortably and fleetingly, at the future. And so I decided to launch a few sailboats in that direction. We did a number of studies for the Congress. An exceptionally good one, I think, was John Heinberg's look at immigration flows. And later we developed a methodology to help us called Prospective Evaluation Synthesis. Eleanor keeps coming back to the centrality of evaluation purpose. Noted in the earlier video, distinguishing accountability from evaluation for management, from evaluation for learning and knowledge, and was always conscious that the purpose of an evaluation conditions the use that can be expected of it. Eleanor was very much an advocate of contingency thinking, of adapting the evaluation methods to the context, to the purpose of evaluation. And therefore she opposed thinking of randomized controlled trials as the gold standard. The standard she advocated was to be sure that the evaluation methods were appropriate to the question and the resources that were available. And so in the debate about quantitative methods and randomized controlled trials as the gold standard, she wrote, "It is as if the Department of Defense were to choose a weapon system without regard for the kind of war being fought, the character, history, and technological advancement of the enemy, or the strategic and tactical givens of the military campaign." And so, in contrast to treating randomized controlled trials as a gold standard, Eleanor Chelimsky waxed eloquent about strong evaluations. This statement is one that you may well want to include in proposals that you write, in methods and design sections of your reports, because it's so wonderfully eloquent about what constitutes a strong evaluation. She wrote, "Strong evaluations employ methods of analysis that are appropriate to the question, support the answer with evidence, document the assumptions, procedures, and modes of analysis, and rule out the competing evidence. Strong studies pose questions clearly, address them appropriately, and draw inferences commensurate with the power of the design and the availability, validity, and reliability of the data. Strength should not be equated with complexity, nor should strength be equated with the degree of statistical manipulation of the data. Neither infatuation with complexity nor statistical incantation makes an evaluation stronger. The strength of the evaluation is not defined by a particular method. Longitudinal, experimental, quasi-experimental, before and after, and case study evaluations can be either strong or weak. That is, the strength of an evaluation has to be judged within the context of the question, the time and cost constraints, the design, the technical adequacy of the data collection and analysis, and the presentation of the findings. A strong study is technically adequate and useful. In short, it is high in quality. A strong statement, a powerful statement about strong evaluations, and I don't think you'll find a better, more concise, and insightful statement of what strong evaluations are. Her obituary acknowledged that she loved evaluation fiercely and continued to work in the field well into her 90s. She published a piece on global warming 3 months prior to her death. So let me close with her thoughts about evaluation's future and a final short video clip. She wrote, "About evaluation's future, I would stress 2 quite basic things. We need to think about an evaluation now. The first has to do with the training of new evaluators entering government. We should not be producing so many Johnny One-Notes, so many evaluators who show up for work knowing only one methodology, usually survey research or the randomized field experiment. Of course, they need to know them all in the modern world of evaluation and be ready to mix them, depending on the evidence and data requirements of the question needing to be answered. In the same way, evaluators need to know how economists, engineers, and political scientists, to name only those, deal with evaluation questions in their different disciplines. One of our problems here is that the university environment often interferes with interdisciplinary work. You get the Nobel Prize for working in your own discipline, not for sharing techniques with others." The second thing I would stress is the study of context. I think that so long as we try to force-fit evaluative ideas into political or social milieu without understanding those milieu, we'll never get them in. So we need to understand bureaucracy if we want government to listen to us. We need to understand other evaluative professions, both to borrow their methods and let them borrow ours. And we need to pick up some friends along the way. Evaluation really has to fit in, even amid the alien corn, and we must find partners, even though speaking truth to power is not calculated to bring us advocates. Perhaps the best way to do this is by avoiding zealotry, whether about methods or anything else. If we can remember that there is no such thing as perfection, I think we'll survive, find allies, flourish, and do an amazing job in helping to make government more transparent, more effective, and more publicly accountable. In thinking about the future, she wanted to build on what we've learned. She wrote, quote, "I'm also worried that when the time comes to actually do something, we will not look back over what we have learned in the 60s and 70s about, say, community policing and equality before the law, but start instead from scratch with a million new theories, try to harmonize a million goals, and end up with nothing. She was talking about what was learned from programming and policies in the 60s and 70s, but we can also talk about what was learned in evaluation from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s from Eleanor Chelimsky and her work. And so I want to close out with a short video, her interview with George Grobe, in which he asked her what advice she would have for young evaluators, newcomers, and the future of evaluation.
I think it's also important to understand going in that you're the weak actor in this, that the politics of everything is going to sublimate what you do. And in some ways, you shouldn't go in expecting to win. You should go in expecting to be heard, to raise awareness. That should be the goal. And some people are so disappointed when they can't get something done and change the world,
That's
you know?
right, yeah.
But that's not what evaluation is about. Yeah. It's a slow business.
Exactly.
It progresses, and I think if you understand that, you're happier, because it's a marvelous field, you know. I mean, you just love going to work in the morning.
If I could,
but my sense of taking away, I think we have to look at evaluation in a more systematic, not systematic, but systemic way. We are systematic, but we're not systemic. We don't think of all of the world that we're functioning in. It isn't just a matter of thinking. It's a matter of understanding political trends. It's a matter of understanding the past. You know what Faulkner said, that marvelous thing, the past is never dead, it isn't even past. You know, it's in everybody's head.
Right.
And when you're talking with practitioners, for instance, in a healthcare study, they're thinking about, you know, how their great mentor of the 1920s was doing something, or probably 1950s. I'm getting old, so 1920 seems to be when people were being born. But, you know, my sense is that it's important to understand where people are coming from. And as practitioners, as people going through a program. When I first went to GAO, I saw all kinds of evaluations of old people's programs that never interviewed a single old person.
Right.
Never. They talked to the administrators, they talked to the people running the programs, but nobody had a clue what it was like to go through those programs. And of course, the real issue for old people in so many of these is, were they treated with dignity or not?
Yes.
And you don't get that from any of those evaluations. There's no way to get them. So my sense is we should think more systemically.
It's so marvelous to listen to Eleanor, to hear her voice and her insights. I want to close with her reflections on the power of a single, authentic voice. She said, quote, "It's a fact of life that we often lose the struggle to get our findings considered seriously and used in policymaking. But I think it helps to remember that speaking out obstinately is sometimes necessary in negotiations in a political environment, and that with time and patience, even a small voice, if it's credible, has a good chance to be heard." She concluded, "Evaluators, like artists, are, in Seamus Heaney's words, quote, on the side of undeceiving the world," close quote. What a marvelous phrase for our times. Evaluators are on the side of undeceiving the world. That is our calling. That was her vision for us. It's my vision for myself and for our work. It's a wonderful vision for us all together, undeceiving the world. And that is needed now more than ever. And what I think that means is, she says, being vigilant and skeptical, but also hopeful in the public realm. She remained vigilant and skeptical and hopeful. And that is a part of her legacy. She wrote, in concluding her interview in the American Journal of Evaluation, she quoted Camus, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough. We should imagine Sisyphus as happy." And you could tell from those interviews and from her writings that Eleanor Chelimsky was engaged in the struggle toward the heights, and we can imagine her happy and calling for us to stay the course, continue the struggle, and in the word of the 60s, find our evaluation bliss. And so I close with this slide, the Statue of the Republic from Paris, where Eleanor spent such formative period. She has passed this torch on to us, the torch of undeceiving reality, of carrying on the struggle for truth, for use, for credible information toward a more sustainable and equitable future. Thank you, Eleanor Chelimsky, for your vision, for your inspiration, and for being you.